Turtles all the way down. I'm Jake, sometimes Jenk. Been away for a little while, away from the podcast, it seems. I guess the goal is to put something out, more or less once a week if we can. And the last couple of weeks I've been kind of in I don't know what the hell happened. It's kind of hard to tell whether it's, is it the winter blahs? Is it seasonal adjustment disorder? Is it the fact that I'm doing maybe a little less exercise than I should? Is it the fact that I have been, over the last month, maybe taking a little bit more psychedelics than I should? But whatever the reason, I felt like I was kind of in a funk, dare I say depression. And then something funny happened the last few days. The problem is, we know when things go down that path, I don't often know what to attribute that happening. I got to say, like the last few days, it turned around for me. And why did it turn around? Well, for one thing, it was warm the last couple of days, and it didn't feel like winter. There was sunshine. I was walking around. So I was doing a little bit more exercise, getting out there and getting some fresh air. That might have helped. In terms of the psychedelics, I did cut down a little bit on that one that I was doing. And it has been quite a while, I'm thinking maybe a year since I've tried a therapeutic MDMA dose, and I did a little bit of that a few days ago as well. And maybe that's the reason I've kind of turned around this depressive state into a more positive, alive, vigorous, appreciating things mode of being, which didn't seem to be possible even like a week ago. And for whatever reason, it's now better. It's a state of control. I feel more in control. And I got to say, if you ask the people that know me, most of them will say that I seem to be in control most of the time. I have my bouts of momentary rage when I'm, obstructed in traffic, mind you. But generally speaking, I seem to be in control of myself. And I think I've kind of perpetuated that understanding of myself. It served me well, but as with almost any way that we project ourselves to the world, it's not necessarily, the most accurate version of things. So, despite the fact that I give off that impression to the world of being in control, I sometimes lose a degree of control, and it feels like I'm not in control. And when that happens, I tend to retreat. That seems to be my thing. And maybe I retreat because I don't want the world to see that I am capable of not being in control. And that might be it. And there's a long tradition of this, of retreat. You've got the story of, Jesus going off into the desert. You've got Nietzsche's Zarathustra living up in the mountains. You've got, Henry David Thoreau, Walden, getting away from people and going back to nature was a strategy for them. There seems to be some of that going on in the current younger generation with the new hippies or hipsters. This going back to the land and taking up farming and crafts and what have you. And maybe an extreme version of that is somebody like the Unabomber who checks out from society and lives in a cabin in the woods. These are all, I think, reactions to having a sense of losing control. And one of the ways that we lose control is through a experience of increased complexity. The way that you take control of something, I think, is to understand it in some sense, to have some kind of understanding of it so that you can affect change. If you find that it's getting very complex all around you or within you, you start to see that you're losing control. And retreat is one of the options. Now, when it gets really bad, when the situation within my personal self, let's say, gets to the point of out of control to such an extent, I might, and I did over the last couple of weeks, which is somewhat rare for me, consider submitting to something as a way out of it, in the sense that, it seems like things are getting out of control, and maybe the way to counteract that is to supply control from without. So, it got me to thinking about things like, well, should I impose some kind of order or structure on myself from without? Should I maybe train for a marathon? Or, maybe take up a project with a friend to create a song together and produce it? Or, I even started considering taking on some, maybe some kind of Buddhist approach to things, taking on some kind of a practice, maybe getting into yoga, these Eastern ways that seem to be effective and pragmatic approaches to such things. And that's kind of difficult for me. It's been hard for me to be, as they say, in the moment. And this is something that keeps coming up in a lot of these Eastern philosophies, let's say, and even some of these, a lot of these self-help type approaches. There's this notion of being in the moment. And I had an experience today that kind of made me think about this a little bit more. I was going to meet a friend for brunch this morning, and she got there quite a bit earlier than I expected, and I hadn't even left my house. And so, I got out there, I started running at first. And I started thinking, oh my God, I'm being an asshole again. I mean, she suggested that we meet there so that I didn't have to, waste some of my time and maybe wait for her there. And it turns out that here I am, the selfish jerk who ends up actually making her wait. And I felt bad about that. And I guess it's maybe some empathy that I have, that I started worrying about it and, started running to get there quickly and then worrying while I'm running of the effect that I'm having on somebody else. And then I realized I kind of maybe looked a little silly, in my boots and winter jacket running down the street. Am I going to scare people running up behind them? So I thought, I'll stop running. And once I did, this kind of realization set upon me that I think is somewhat wise, but that I often forget. And it was this understanding and realization that, I was going to get there if I walk at a brisk pace. I was going to get there in about 10 minutes. She's going to have to wait for me for 10 minutes. That's going to have the effect that it has on her. I could spend the next 10 minutes walking in a brisk pace and worrying about this and having essentially a very unpleasant experience. Or I could shut that out, kind of go on autopilot and say, okay, I'm walking there at a brisk pace. I've taken care of that. The body's functioning and doing what it needs to do. Now I can kind of spend my time being in the moment, walking while appreciating walking. Maybe letting my mind go into other things and thinking about, abstract thoughts, which I like to do. And guess what? It worked. I mean, it felt like I had a very enjoyable 10-minute walk. I enjoyed the surroundings as I walked past them. I had some profound thoughts and interesting ideas. So when I arrived for brunch, I wasn't in this frantic state of excitement and anxiety. I arrived with kind of a sense of calm, a sense of openness, and I even had some interesting ideas to start conversations with these thoughts that I had during that time. Kind of reminded me of the Addicts Anonymous or Alcoholics Anonymous Serenity Prayer, which says something to the effect of, grant me the serenity to accept the things that I cannot change. And I kind of took that to heart. And it's a useful technology to apply that. And it was useful for me to apply that over that 10 minutes. And then it got me to thinking, this worked for me. I spent that 10 minutes in a way that I'm not normally able to do. And I was able to have a better experience of it and become, at least temporarily, and maybe as a form of habit forming, I became a better person as a result of it. But then I thought, where does this go? If I'm going to get into this mode where I'm not thinking about how she's feeling waiting for me, and I'm able to shut that out, and I'm able to just focus on the moment, what's going to happen over time? Do I eventually turn into an asshole? that doesn't care about other people because I get so good at it? It kind of made me wonder and worry. But, after some consideration, I think these guys might have been onto something. Because I got to think that if everyone was doing that more often, yeah, I don't see that as a bad thing. Another thing about these, this AA approach is and one of the basic concepts that they have is that there's a requirement to submit to a higher power. They will tell you that you really can't take or get to where you want to go until you submit to something. Either it's a kind of a god. I have a problem with submission. I was kind of raised, and I guess my father instilled in me a lot of these ideas coming from where he came from, which was kind of I don't know what you'd call it, kind of a underworld type masculine honor system. And in that, you don't submit. You don't give in. You don't bend over, as they say. It's very difficult for me as a result to submit to anything. And I don't know if that's genetic or if it's been taught to me or what have you, but to such an extent that I'd have to say that I have difficulty submitting even to love, because that's a form of losing yourself or losing control. You can submit to God, you can submit to another human, you can submit to the moment. I have problems with submitting to a God or to another man or woman in the case of love, in my case. But I think I might be okay with submitting to the moment. What I thought was maybe kind of a preposterous or even kind of silly or naive thing to say, that is to be in the moment all the time. I still don't think it's a good idea to be in the moment all the time. There has to be moments when you're worrying about the future and thinking about the past, of course. And that's one of the reasons our human species has done so well, because we worried about the future. We developed all of these technologies and science and understanding so that we don't have to worry about what's coming around the corner because we're able to predict it. Okay, so what happens in a society that seems to feel the experience of losing control? Well, a similar thing could happen. And by that I mean, one of the ways to react to that would be the society asking for more outside control. And this happens. And this is a very common pattern that we see throughout history. And also I'd have to say that there are a lot of people that are aware of this, conscious of this, and intentionally create situations that will accentuate fear and chaos, complexity, a lack of understanding, a lack of trust in information and truth. And that kind of loss of control causes some societies, and the large segments of them, to ask for more outside control, to actually ask for authoritarian response, to ask for more rules, more homeland security, give up all of your or many of your rights to feel secure. And that happens. And I think we're seeing that happen around the world right now. People are getting freaked out. There's technological advancements, there's climate change, there's the wars and refugee crisis. People seeing this complexity and not knowing how to deal with it, I think are also asking for structure from without. Submitting. But I like to think they're doing that a little too easily. What do I know? Maybe submission is the secret to all of this. I'm more open to it, at least for the moment, to submit to the moment. Look at me. Just a week ago, it seemed like I was in such a funk and I wasn't able to do a monologue. It didn't even seem possible. And here I am, in a positive mood, talking to you. Well, this conversation that you're going to hear next is with Ana Serrano. She's with the Canadian Film Centre. We had a very interesting conversation. Hope you enjoy it. Talk soon.
Yeah.
Perfect. Welcome, Anna.
Thanks, Jake.
Yeah. So we had already started talking as is usual. And I guess the first question we started to ask ourselves is, when we're talking about the inner circle around Trump, whether or not there is, I guess the troubling thing is we can't figure out whether it's incompetence or evil. Like, is it something
or it's malevolent incompetence?
Right. Yeah. And that might be the saving grace, is that, because what I'm sensing is that there is a lot of malevolence there. At least when we're talking about someone like a Trump, it seems to me that there is malevolence, but the fact that there's incompetence associated with it might be the thing that actually helps us in this case, that they're not able to do all the things that maybe they could otherwise. So something to maybe have a little optimism about.
Yeah, I mean, today the New Yorker just published a great article, which I shared with a bunch of friends, because I felt that it actually gave a little bit of hope. So, and it started with a tweet by Umair Haque, who's this economist / social media maven that I follow on Twitter and Medium. And he says something like this, where he says, Americans misjudged the authorities, but the authorities equally misjudged Americans. And it's really an article that kind of outlines all of the civil actions that have taken place since the 9 days of Trump coming on board, whether that's Washington State suing him, judges, creating stays on the orders that were presented in the immigration ban, just ordinary Americans protesting, petitions being signed. So it really kind of says there's a concerted effort by a number of different individuals and civil society and the civic administration to stop the craziness.
So you are interpreting it as a kind of a craziness. It's, there's a lot of people right now, and in fact, some of these psychologists that were, forbidden from coming out and diagnosing a public figure are kind of breaking that tradition and coming out and saying, well, this is too dangerous to let slide. And a lot of people are making, and we've all been doing it amongst friends, are kind of armchair psychologizing about what's going on. What do you think is going on inside the head of someone like a Trump? I mean, I
don't know. I mean, I'm not a psychologist. I don't claim to even want to sort of diagnose. However, I have posted on Facebook and amongst my friends, and I do feel that he probably does suffer from some sort of malignant narcissism. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that, unfortunately, I've had the experience of being friends with a variety of folks who have had to endure being with malignant narcissists and the kind of lawsuits and just awful kind of stuff they've had to go through to extricate themselves from their delusions. So, and it seems very similar to me. So just based on this kind of like super non-evidence-based, but sort of gut feel, anecdotal type of thing, it wouldn't surprise me if someone did actually say that this was what he was suffering from.
It seems like we have, in our culture, we have checks and balances for this type of behavior. And I guess I could just imagine someone like Trump growing up and displaying the characteristics that we see him displaying right now as a child. And normally that gets, for lack of a better word, beaten out of you, in the sense that, the world kind of juts up against these kind of behaviors, and kind of the checks and balances come in place where people see that it's not successful to be like that, and they're kind of tempered down, and people change as a result of the environment and the society in which they're running around in. But if you happen to be someone like him, who is in a very privileged family, essentially from childbirth he has a bunch of yes men. around. And these kind of behaviors are not corrected. They're, in fact, quite often encouraged. And it seems like having a father figure that encourages that kind of thing is what the situation was in that case. And so we do need to think about the personal psychology of people because, especially in a case like him, because it's an opposition now. In a way, there's a resistance. So you have to, I don't want to use the term enemy, but you have to know what you're up against. And so we find ourselves, trying to figure all this out. And
Well, I think one of the other things that I'm trying to grapple with is what are the layers of the onion? So if on the one hand you have this sort of person in power with a particular psychology that is at best inconsistent, at worst malevolent, okay? Right. What else is part of that onion layer? And I think the other part of that onion layer may very well be, we've heard this said many times, a kind of a Faustian pact that some of the RNC Congress people have made with this particular person. So there's that layer that we need to contend with. And then there's that inner circle layer, which is really made up of a bunch of folks who've never really had or held political office, who are now part of the power structure. And so what are their motivations and what's their agenda? So you've got potentially not the same agendas at all across these three layers, just for that one to think about, but somehow they're similar enough that they're willing to go along with a certain set of actions in order to push their agendas forward. And when it's that kind of sort of, let's say, I don't know what to call it, like managed chaos, okay, that they're ensuing, it can sometimes be very difficult to figure out as a resistance block which parts of it you're supposed to fight first.
And that makes it even more difficult.
Yeah.
And I guess a lot of people are starting to talk about his advisor, Steve Bannon, these days. It looks like he might be, or at least maybe this is incorrect, but a lot of people seem to be focusing on him as being kind of pulling the strings and making a lot of these decisions and maybe even writing executive orders. There's definitely a sense of inexperience and incompetence in the way they're doing it. But when it comes to someone like a Bannon, there's at least we're starting to attribute something like a plan to him. Whereas with Trump, there doesn't seem to be a plan other than self-aggrandizement. And, like the typical of a narcissist wants to have people talking about him all the time, wants to have power, wants to diminish the power of others that resist him. These seem very typical behaviors. But with a Bannon, there's kind of a more of an uncertainty. He seems to be more capable of, parsing things and figuring stuff out. And as a result, I think a lot of people are rightly seeing him as being more dangerous, more like someone like a Cheney or a Rumsfeld compared to a George Bush, who seemed to be kind of a, dopey, happy-go-lucky guy.
Yeah, it's hard to pin down exactly, though, where he's coming from. So, again, this is I am by no means an expert in sort of the American political system or how things work. And I certainly, one of the interesting things that has ensued as a result of all of these changes down south is the commitment of the ordinary citizen to inform themselves. And I'm certainly one of those people. Yeah. And so this is coming from sort of a lay person's perspective, someone who essentially is reading mostly media and blog type information rather than someone who's studied political history or historical tracts for a long time. And based on that type of shallow reading, if you will, what I find difficult to grapple with in the case of Bannon is I find it very difficult to pin him down in terms of what exactly his ideology is. So I recently read the transcript of a speech or a conference he gave in the Vatican in 2014, which I think BuzzFeed was the one who posted this transcript, the full transcript. And it's very bizarre, the kinds of pieces that he pulls into to create his particular worldview. It's coherent, but it's definitely made up of fragments that don't seem to belong to each other. So parts of the fragments include things like, railing against neoliberalism, if you will, or railing against sort of excess and things like that. And you can imagine, normal, everyday sort of citizens having those same feelings that, yeah, sure, we should we should not be so excessive. There is something wrong with, the inequality that's that the sort of almost presented itself over the past 12 years, but it's coupled with sort of this this kind of new framing of capitalism, which he calls those types of corporate capitalism is very different from traditional capitalism or Christian capitalism, certainly a phrase I've never heard before. And so there's all this kind of weird stuff mashed together in this particular speech that he gave that makes for a very difficult guy to pin for me. And I say all that stuff about not having that expertise because perhaps for someone who's been studying this stuff, they know exactly how to pin him down. Yeah. But for the average person like myself who just reads this stuff in blogs or in newspapers, it's hard to know exactly where this guy's coming from.
Yeah. And, we're getting a lot of our information from our so-called bubble. And, I think you were saying earlier that you like to go on Trump feeds sometimes to see what's happening. I really haven't had much strength to do that. I did come across a person that I was recently about to do a business deal with, and I realized by looking on their Facebook page that they were a Trump supporter, and that gave me a lot of pause. Yeah. I had to really stop and think, do I even want to engage this person? Because I almost felt like there was kind of an indicator that there might be a fundamental difference enough that we might not be able to, work on some things on maybe a moral, ethical level. But it got me to thinking that, before the advent of social media, I probably did business with a lot of people that were probably a lot more questionable than this fellow, but I wouldn't have noticed necessarily. And you have to kind of go by what you see. And, being, I guess, of the left in some sense, we have this notion in us that... let's face it, it's motivated by trying to make the world a better place. I mean, it's ridiculed by the right sometimes, but... the right and the left are trying to, they're looking at the world within a framework that they believe to be true. And that the reason they're doing that is they think what they're going to do is make the world better in some sense. The sense I get from people like the Trump and tends to a lot of the politicians as well, it's what justifies and what determines the better outcome is if it's better for themselves. As opposed to where the left tends to be more about the outcome is determined to be better if it's better for a larger number of people or for, the disadvantaged or the poor.
Sure. I actually will disagree with you on that. I don't think that we can say that the kind of like centrist right or even the right, traditional right, whether that's the Tories in Britain or the Conservative Party in Canada or the Republicans in the U.S. I think traditionally many people, left or right, have always wanted what's better for the people. I think we need to approach it as that is the kind of end goal. Now, the how of that, right, may differ in terms of what's better for the people, maybe to pull themselves up by their bootstraps and not get any help from the government, according to some right-wing people, while as what's better for the people, according to some left-wing people, is to get supported and have the ability to actually make a go of a life through some kind of state-sponsored support, right? So that's the how part is potentially what differentiates the two. But I think both camps traditionally have had, the kind of idea that, we need to, we're operating with this thought that we want what's best for the people. Yeah. Where it gets tricky today, I think, is I don't think Trump is traditionally either left or right. And that's really where, we can't paint the Trumpian brush across the entire conservative spectrum, because I think a lot of conservatives and potentially Republicans, although they're not showing as much of that as we wish they would right now, probably are just as appalled by the type of self-serving, self-aggrandizing, lying, sort of malevolent incompetence that's being displayed.
But the fact that they're responding to him in ways of cooperation indicate to me that they're willing to overlook what is probably their more deeply held beliefs in exchange for their own self power and position. So putting that aside, if we take that, if you take it as given that both sides are trying to make the world a better place, whatever side you're on, whether there are sides even. But it seems like where the argument comes together is that the left is always trying to educate, in a sense, saying, well, if they only knew what was really going on, they would see the world like I do. Whereas you quite often hear from, the right-oriented people, similar thing. If they only knew what was going on, the world is actually, they might see it more in terms of that the left is being naive, that they're not seeing that the world is actually a dog-eat-dog.
Let's just talk like specifics in this case. Okay, so I think the core question really is because you could argue, well, our process is to lead from within, and so we're going to figure out a way to get him to see our side and not be so impetuous, and to be a little bit more, managed. That could be what some of his not handlers, but some of his peers in Congress could be saying in the Republican Party. You could imagine someone saying that, right? But I think the core issue is really at what point in a person of authority's reign does silence equal complicity? What has to be? What are the actions that need to be done by that person in authority that would ensure that silence no longer is an option, or sort of this notion of trying to manage from within, and trying to figure out how to potentially fix things without transparency, et cetera. When does that cease to become a rational thing to do? And I think we saw with the immigration ban that started the process of many people starting to think, you know what? Silence is complicity at this point. And so you saw certain Republican Congress people actually sort of calling Trump out on that particular action. You saw a bunch of corporations who, stand to potentially lose all sorts of things, standing up against Trump. So I think it's very interesting to see how far, I guess the question for me, again, based on my readings, et cetera. And one such reading is by a Google programmer who did this blog post on Medium. Unfortunately, I forgot his name. But he sort of had this theory that this type of pushing of that kind of boundary was sort of floating a trial balloon in terms of and this is a theory that sort of doesn't adhere to the notion that they're incompetent.
Right.
It's actually a theory that says there's a master plan to all this. And that somehow by pushing that particular action, the immigration ban action, that they were trying to determine, okay, so who's on our side?
Right.
Who's going to stay silent? How are people going to behave? Who do we
need to fire?
Who do we need to fire? They did fire one person, and that kind of thing.
Yeah. And I guess the next step would be that it's going to go through the courts, and the judges in many cases are going to try and stay these decisions and try to halt it. And if you take that theory in mind, then it's going to be very useful for them to see who actually listens to the judge and who actually listens to the administration.
Yeah.
The people that listen to the judge, and it's already starting to happen. Like in the airports, you saw where people, there was a judge that told them to stop in some cases, and many of the officials there just kept going.
Yeah.
So, that's going to be kind of a test, a loyalty test.
Yeah. No, I know. I mean, scary. At the end of the day, I think this is a time where everyone needs to really pay attention to personal accountability. You know, who are you? Yeah. You know, what do you believe in? You know, what do you value? How are you going to live out those values so that they're explicit to the people around you? And I think we're all being tested for that today.
Yeah. But let's face it, though. I mean, even people like us who I think spend enough time introspecting and thinking, we might not completely be clear on all of those answers. So I'm thinking a lot of people that are just, you know, working day to day, and maybe this airport security official that's there, they haven't really thought this through, and they may have a sense that, well, it's my duty to follow orders, you know, and we see this throughout history where people aren't really given the luxury to be able to stop and think. And, you know, they're kind of forced into decisions. And quite often the decisions that they make are, you know, done within the framework that they're working and whatever they've been used to and the culture that they've been put into. If the norms are that, you know, your duty is to follow orders, then there's going to be quite a significant number of people that are going to just follow through and be, you know, minions for the cause of nefariousness. And obviously, you know, you can think of historical examples where this shit happens all the time, but we don't have a population that necessarily knows all this. So it's more about emotional reactions and fear and comfort and, you know, not making waves and that sort of thing. And it's like these type of nefarious type people rely on that form of acquiescence that comes with just, you know, being basically having your nose to the grindstone all day long and working, which brings us to neoliberalism in a way, because it seems like that was kind of set up the processes in a way that this is where we ended up.
Well, I'd like to take this in a slightly different direction, which is, my mother is actually, who's one of my, like, you know, like, I'm not worthy kind. I'm doing this with my hands
Much
right
respect.
now. When she retired, she opened up the Center for Mindfulness-Based Studies in Parkdale. And so she's the executive director and co-founder with Patricia Rockman, who's a psychotherapist and did a lot of mindfulness-based therapy, cognitive therapy. Anyway, her whole kind of reason for doing this is because she thought, you know, society is kind of at a pressure point, and there's really not enough resources going around. Populations are exploding. Government resources are not as high as they should be. You know, inequalities rising, etc. So the front line of social justice warriors, those are the long-term care workers, the nurses, the doctors, social workers, you know, homeless people, you know, the people who take care of the homeless and deal with food security. They need to be armed with the right tools to handle the pressures that are just going to continue and amplify as society evolves. And so in her thinking, she believes that the actual innovation that needs to occur is less about technology and more about the innovation of the mind. And so can we use these hundreds of year old practices, either just pure mindfulness practice or ones that have been co-opted to work with other therapeutic practices in the 20th century, like cognitive therapy, so mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, to manage our reactivity and hence actually evolve us into the type of people we need to be in order to be able to handle exactly this moment we find ourselves in.
Yeah.
And I think that's really where, you know, in a way, this is the kind of turning point of that type of commitment to our evolution as a species. Like, you know, there is a lot of pressures, whether that's climate change or overpopulation or resource management, et cetera, and the fact that we're now growing older, and so, you know, the room, you know, all that stuff. So we need something to help us manage the external context that we now find ourselves in, and perhaps being a little bit more mindful and having that practice will help us get there. Now, that's a long-term strategy, obviously, and it's not something that just happens overnight.
No.
But this might very well be the time to start thinking about that. Now, I have to say something though before I perjure myself further here, which is like, I am the daughter of this woman. I do not practice it every day. So it is hard, right? So so I feel a little bit like a fake by saying this. I believe it deeply, but as of yet, I haven't developed like a full-blown practice. Yeah. But I'm very proud of her for having started this and for seeing it in this kind of context, because I think that's what we need. Do you meditate, Jake?
Someone asked me this the other day, and I said my answer is yeah, probably, because I spend a lot of time alone, just kind of with my eyes closed, even sometimes. But I'm not officially meditating. But I find that that's very similar to meditating in a way. I have a friend who comes over and stays over visiting from out of town, and when he's over, we get up in the mornings and we meditate sometimes. But what you're describing now is kind of pointing to the difficulty of this way of doing. I agree with you. Those sort of things where we're talking about essentially changing the person rather, and starting from that point. But it's almost like we're kind of talking to preaching to the converted all the time when it comes to that, because it's the type of person that wants to kind of engage in that is already taken the step in the first place to want to go there. So it almost seems like we need even a more primary step than that. Like, how do we get the person to even want to join that group? Obviously, we know it'd be effective if everybody did yoga and meditated. I think we'd have a much more peaceful world, of course. But what you find is that that's quite often ridiculed by the masses.
But here's where I think we need to think about it differently. And this is why I'm talking about it as an innovation, a piece of innovation technology. It just is technology of the mind. So it's wetware as opposed to hardware or what have you. And like in the same way that, for example, phys ed became, or like participation became a core sort of societal standard, or in the same way that where no one really litters anymore, making sure that you don't just chuck your garbage out the window. We actually, I think, need to start thinking about mental health and reactivity and managing our reactivity, managing ourselves as a core practice that's just part of what we need to integrate into how to be a more civil and collaborative and society where we just don't live by ourselves, but we actually live with other people,
But how does this come down to the people? Is it a governmental
School,
thing?
I think it's a government. I think it has to. I think it's things
so that's
like,
where you're going to get a lot of resistance, though, right? Because it's almost like anytime somebody proposes anything, where there's already such a vehement opposition to what they consider government overreach into the personal lives of people. I know. It's almost impossible to get this kind of thing through. So we're kind of arrive at that same issue. It's like we have this divide, and we're not able to get over it because we can't get people to even engage.
Although, I think where again, the biggest thing that we all need to sort of, I guess, wrap our heads around is just, there's the long fucking game. And we need to think about the long game as much as we need to think about the immediate game. And the long game is likely going to be things like, doing this stuff with evidence-based research so that we can actually prove that this type of, mode of practice does, reduce, depression or reduce anxiety or reduce stress, that it helps with ADHD, etc. Once we do that evidence-based research, we then do trials in schools, and it seems super boring. And like by the time you talk about it, you might think, good Lord, but that's going to take forever. But that's what we have to do. We actually need to commit to, if you want to change the world, there needs to be a commitment to the long game as much as there needs to be a commitment to, the immediate stuff that we're now finding ourselves having to become more embroiled in, frankly.
Yeah, I agree with you wholeheartedly. I just don't see how we're going to get half of the population, essentially, who are more geared towards authoritarianism, who are suspicious of government, who don't like to be told what to do in almost every circumstance, even when it's good for them. And so, I mean, the left is often left in a position where they are being, in a way, they're starting to treat the populace like children, is what it's perceived as. And maybe we have to, I don't know, and this is the question I come across sometimes. Do you, if you see somebody, and it's the metaphor that I use, punching themselves in the face, do you have a duty to stop them? And if they don't, are we allowed to lie to them? Are we allowed to deceive them and say, well, don't do this because of X, but really it's because of Y, but they're not listening to the real reason. So we have to kind of mollify them. And is that acceptable? And this is, I think, a question that we're going to come to, because it seems like the so-called right don't have a problem with that. It's like, it's more of a practical means base. It's like, if it's going to get the result I want, they're almost willing to do anything to justify that. Whereas the left has more of a moral quandary here. They don't necessarily take that step very easily, and most of them don't, thankfully, I think, because my instinct is don't lie. Even if you think it's good for them, try a little harder. But, we just keep coming across this now where it's not working. And I think a lot of people on the left are thinking, well, what, do I give up? Or do I take on the strategy of the right, which is to maybe even spread false memes? And there's kind of a, not that they're immune to that. There's historical examples of the left doing that. I mean, you look at the Soviet situation. There was a lot of people who considered themselves on the left, but they were completely okay with lying and deceiving everybody to what they thought was going to be an eventually a good result. Or maybe it was just for themselves. I don't know. But, how do we take that step? Are we allowed to lie? Do we need to always tell the truth? Are we disadvantaged by this?
Well, I mean, I honestly don't know anymore who we're talking about,
Right.
Like, I mean, I have no conception as to whether the kind of anti-big government, anti-authoritarian populace that you're kind of labeling as the right, like, how many people are we talking about? Like, I have no idea. Like,
Right.
Are we... because again, part of the issue is because of social media and because of our echo chambers and our bubbles, it's very difficult to get a sense of exactly what we're talking about when we start to think about us and them in those kinds of terms. Like, is it, I can't tell you, like, is it 20% of the population? Is it 10%, 15, 30%? I have no idea.
It's a significant number, whatever that is. And it is a block, right?
Well, yeah. I mean, it might be a block, but I don't know if I really see them behaving as a block, I mean, I think there's many reasons why Trump got voted in, and not all of them by the same people.
That's true.
And in fact, if you look at the popular vote, he didn't win. And so, and I mean, the more kind of scary thing was that whole story around Cambridge Analytics and how they used micro-targeting on Facebook, correlated to data they had on voters, and how easily manipulated people were into assuming that this guy was for them. I think that's what you're referring to in terms of, like, do we use those same kind of techniques to try to get people on side?
That seems wrong to me. Yeah. It's just hard to take that step, but I feel like a lot of people might be considering it these days. It's almost like, we're about to go off this cliff. How am I going to apply the brakes? And maybe the way to do it is I don't know. I mean, I got to say, that's a last step that I wouldn't want to take. But we're up against people that have no, problem with lying, essentially.
Well, that is definitely true. I mean, it is quite phenomenal. Like, watching the news right now and seeing, Spicer and Conway and the president of the United States, like, baldly lie in front of media. It's quite phenomenal.
Yeah. And I guess, he didn't win the popular vote, and the percentage of people that voted were low to begin with. So, I mean, some people will say that only, less than 30% of the people have supported him. And so as a result, you're seeing a lot of people out protesting these days. And like the Women's March, for example, was a huge success, and we got millions of people out there protesting. And I wonder what is the efficacy of that? It seems like a great thing to get people together and motivated, and maybe politicized in some senses that they weren't before, to get together and actually then think about what we need to do. But quite often what you find is the opposition uses that against them. And this is the conversation I had with this fellow. Like, we're talking about something, and then his response was, "Yeah, but look at all those, those people breaking windows and, setting cars on fire." And I said, "What are you talking about?" It's just such a, obviously anytime you get 1 million people together, you're going to have 5 or 6 people do that. But I said, maybe consider that the cameras are just focusing on the people that are doing that. And it didn't occur to him that people don't know they're in a bubble necessarily. And it's kind of frightening to see what you consider to be so obvious, that as someone you're talking to that seems quite rational is missing a point. But they're thinking the same thing about me, probably. It's like, oh, what a sucker. He's not seeing how the world really works. I get the feeling that they're thinking, oh, how naive he is that he thinks, we can just take care of everybody. Where they're kind of seeing it in a Darwinian way. It's like, survival of the fittest. And this seems to happen in historical periods when there's turmoil, when there's an economics of scarcity, when there's a younger demographic, when you have a lot of men in their 20s in any population, shit hits the fan. And, that's happened in the Middle East. And in America, maybe because of the fact that we tend to leave childhood a little later, maybe we're seeing more people in their 30s that are, kind of going through this phase rather than early on you would see in other parts of the world. Yeah.
How to deal with the bubble. I do think that this is a wake-up call for, late 20th century media in terms of the role that the social media networks and technology in general has played in kind of exacerbating the sort of, either call it partisanship, call it tribalism, call it, polarization of, worldviews, if you will. And I think that's something that I'm thinking deeply about in terms of how to help support technologies, startups, founders, and things like that, who are looking at that very specific problem of, is there an alternative to networks and technology companies whose core sort of business model rests around high levels of engagement. And really what's happened is that these technologies, just because that's where their business model lies, is to make people as engaged as possible, they've discovered that using sort of unconscious bias types of things, which are many, supports increased levels of engagement. And so that's really why we're finding ourselves only talking to the same people who think like us. Yeah. And that's a big, 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 hairy problem, which is actually, I shouldn't say that. It's not a big It's not a big, hairy problem to solve. It's a problem that can easily be solved. And in fact, there have been some folks, individuals who just said, well, here's how to solve the fake news problem, or here's how to solve this. The fact is, it can be solved technologically. The question is, who's going to pay for it?
Right. Yeah.
So so I think those are a number of things we all need to think about, which is, for those people who believe that this is not a good thing to immerse yourself in, just the singular, homogeneous echo chamber you find yourselves in, are you willing to put your money where your mouth is? Yeah. Yeah. Will you subscribe to those? Will you leave Facebook? Will you leave those kinds of safe? And they're safe, and that they're comfortable, and they're, you know what to expect. And
so, how do you feel about the response of the technology world? Like the Silicon Valley leaders going and meeting with Trump, for example. It's getting a lot of blowback from the people that are in those communities. How do you think they're reacting to it? Because you're focused on technological solutions in a sense. Yeah.
Well, at first I was sort of I have to say, somewhat. My first gut instinct was like disappointment that they would even meet with him, blah blah blah, right?
Yeah.
And then obviously, like, someone would slam me and goes, "What are you, some university grad? Like, what do you think they're gonna do?" Of course they have to.
They're not going to refuse a seat at the table.
They're not going to refuse a seat at the table. They're beholden to their shareholders. Like, that's the responsible thing to do, et cetera. And of course, that makes sense. And certainly the kind of almost universal dismay at the ban, at the Muslim ban, shows where Silicon Valley kind of
but
lies.
did they react to that simply because they have so many immigrants in their workforce, or is it a moral position? I can't. It seems like if their workforce was all didn't tend to be like a lot of people from East India and China and places like that, maybe they wouldn't have reacted that way. That's kind of gives me some pause. And then there are also
quick question: do you think it matters?
Which?
Whether or not they're doing it for pragmatic sake, or whether they're doing it because of a moral.
I think it does matter. It's a difference in the sense that, the result in this case is going to be equally good, whether it's motivated by X or Y. But if their position is such that they're going to make decisions like that, then you can kind of worry about the decisions that they may make in the future. Because if they're being guided by an ethics, a morality, some kind of a deeper understanding of that we have in common in terms of what goodness is and how society should function, and they make that decision based on that, I think that's better, because it's going to kind of guarantee that they'll make better decisions in the future. If it's just pragmatic in the sense that they want to protect their own, bottom line because their workers tend to have people with visas from other countries, I don't think that's acceptable, and I think they need to maybe think a little deeper.
I mean, my feeling is it's likely a bit of both. I think I'm not the type of person who normally thinks of most people as being evil. Like, I actually don't think that at all. But I do think that most people don't know when enough is enough. And when I mean enough is enough, it's really this like growth imperative that we're now finding ourselves in. So if there's any kind of disappointment that I might have in Silicon Valley or the technology companies, et cetera, it's that, they're fucking massive. They're like monopolies.
Yeah.
They make a shitload of money. And sure, it's good that Zuckerberg has decided to create a foundation, but there does seem to be this sense that somehow, I think when you grow to be that monetarily powerful, you just end up gaining more influence. Okay, whether that's social influence. With that comes a sense of political influence. And I think it's very difficult then not to move into that next level, which is to think that you can actually fix everything.
Right. Yeah.
And so that's where it gets tricky, because, entitlement is a slippery slope, that and privileged entitlement is a slippery slope, and meaning that it's a very, very, there's a fine line probably between the Thiels of the world and the I don't know whether this is actually true, but I'll say it anyway, the Thiels of the world and the Zuckerbergs of the world, where you can kind of assume, government doesn't really know what they're doing and I can help them fix everything, and you don't actually need big government, and the market will correct itself and you don't really need to do anything else. So I think that's very easy to slide into when you have that much money and when you have that much power and when you have that much influence. And
also I think it's the people that are in Silicon Valley are probably more susceptible to that type of thinking, because I've worked with a lot of people in this field, the technology, and I call it the engineering mindset sometimes. It's like everything is more black and white in their world than maybe some others. And there's another issue there. They tend to be, let's face it, a lot of them are young men. And a lot of young men in their 20s, I think, have not really developed the empathy that they may or may not develop later in life. I mean, thinking in terms of my own personal situation, I was around that environment in my 20s, and yeah, the world seemed very like, you work hard, you're smart, you're going to get something. If you're complaining, it probably means that you're just not working hard enough. I mean, those kind of mindsets were very easy to take on. It's when you grow this, what I call, empathetic or emotional intelligence, I think comes a little later for men than women. I mean, I'm gonna make that differentiation. I've noticed it myself and in my friends. Silicon Valley is comprised greatly, a great deal by these people, and dare I say, I think they may have an immature view of the world in a sense that they're going to have a lot of faith in technological solutions, which may also lead us down dark corridors, without enough empathetic thought about how it's going to affect and what are the fundamental reasons that we're doing these things,
Yeah. Well, I mean, one of the things that I rail against right now is sort of this next evolution of virtual reality. So, it became super hot in 2012 when Paul Berlucky did his Kickstarter campaign, raised millions of dollars for Oculus, and then Facebook bought it for $3 billion. I think it's $2 or $3 billion. And then, fast forward to today, and it's like, and one of the things that I like to talk about is to say, look, we know what techno-idealism has brought. I've been in the tech sector for a long time, in the digital media space and new media space, and that's been where my career has been. And so I remember when, everyone was feeling super idealistic about, the California project, AKA the hippies project, being realized in the technosphere through the advent of decentralized networks and, the
open source realm.
And also the kind of like killing the command control kind of hierarchical models of organization and stuff like that. So at the time, in the early 90s, late 80s, etc., everyone was quite optimistic and that this was amazing. And I met a ton of amazing people including myself, who really believed that this could be a differentiated media space. Fast forward to today, it is absolutely a differentiated media space, but not in the way that we thought, So you have advertising-driven sort of social networks. You have, monopolies being created. You have sort of no public spaces on the internet, highly commercial kind of spaces, with the exception of a few places here and there. And what is curious about VR is that it seems to be following exactly the same pattern as what the web was like in 1994, where people were thinking this is going to save us, this is going to be the future of humanity, etc. But VR is actually contextualized and is smack in the middle of a socio political economic infrastructure of the digital network society that's very much still about advertising driven big data collection, et cetera, that have proven to be quite problematic. And yet no one's really talking about VR in that sense. So I do think, I take your point in terms of how in Silicon Valley everything's happy all the time, and that is a problem because we need to see technological innovation within the context in which it's occurring and figure out how to actually evolve that context as much as we're evolving the technologies themselves.
So is there a technological solution, do you think? Or is there, do we hold out hope for something? For example, Facebook came out, and who knew 10 years ago that it was going to be so incredibly ingrained in our everyday worlds? And it is having an impact on our politics. And maybe this election might have a lot to do with the way that the Facebook algorithms were put in place, whether there's any kind of nefarious intention or not. This is the way it happened. is there hope that there's something on the horizon that we're not even seeing that's going to make it? Is that the kind of a technological hope that there is, that there's something that we don't know yet?
Well, that's what I mean. I think if we don't contextualize technology, if we continue to think of technology as somehow neutral and that all we have to do is actually build it and then we'll figure it out later, then no, there will never be, like, it will just continue to kind of like sort of lead us to wherever the hell it might lead us. But I think it behooves the people in the space, whether that's creators or whether that's hardware manufacturers or whether that's like middleware people, etc., to if they actually care about this stuff, because some of them might not,
right.
To really say, okay, well, how is it what I'm building paying attention to the context, you know? So for example, certain VR creators could say, I will never ever use an eye tracking head mounted display because I don't believe that tracking where people look is any data that I'm interested in collecting, and that I don't even want that data to be collected by other people. And so I'm not going to use that. Or I'm not going to use the Oculus Rift ever because the same terms and conditions on Oculus apply as the ones on Facebook apply to Oculus Rift. And I don't agree in those terms and conditions. So I'm not going to do that. I have to say there aren't many people I know who are saying these things.
Right. Yeah.
So it's really about, making that, you just have to keep repeating. I mean, I'm basically like a broken record. I keep repeating this over and over again to see maybe one or two people think the same way, and then we can start talking about what that means.
Right. Well, I guess these technological innovations that we're talking about, they're guided by the incentives that we have in our system, and the incentives in our system are pretty much steered towards obviously money. I mean, it's if there's not if you can't monetize something, it seems like no one's interested in pursuing it. And as we've gone along, and maybe because of the neoliberals' policies, it seems like more and more of the alternative incentive regimes are being removed. Everything's being leveled down to its value monetarily. And when you get that, you have a very kind of a narrow region of directions we can go into. And, when you have someone like Peter Thiel that we mentioned, or people like him seem to have a little too much zeal in terms of, the way that some of these technologies could go. And maybe they're just as worried about the techno leaders as they are of politicians. And this is kind of feeding into this anti-elite sentiment that you're seeing. And that has always been kind of a dangerous sentiment that's been in throughout history. And we see this quite often, that we essentially have pogroms against the educated once in a while. The people just rise up and say, oh, fuck those people, and in the pitchforks, and whether or not they had anything to do with their misery, they're bayoneted. That happens a lot. And, I guess the worry is that it might be happening again. And there's people that, bring out the comparisons to the Weimar Republic, in the 30s. And it's been up until this point something that would be ridiculed. Like anytime somebody brought up Hitler in an argument, there's those, it would be, shouted down and saying, oh, you're just being silly. But I honestly think this is the closest that we've ever gotten to similarity. And I think there's a lot of value in comparing those frameworks to see, because this is what we do. Like we impose worldviews or frameworks of understanding. And lately I've been trying to do more of that in terms of like thinking of culture as maybe like a human body, or thinking of culture as maybe like a computing device, or thinking of like, how does water flow? And does that help us to understand how, the people and policies and ideas are flowing? Like how are genes expressed in a body, and how does that relate to like memes being spread throughout the world as packets of information? These are useful. I guess there's a battle of which worldview to impose on the understanding, and we're kind of at that level where we're kind of having a battle of fundamental worldview ideas. Like, is it survival of the fittest, or is it not? It's that kind of if you see kind of the world in a Darwinian approach, you're gonna make your decisions completely differently than if you see it in a Christian worldview or Muslim worldview or technocratic worldview. Everything. So what I'm saying is that I guess we need to talk about more fundamental things. Whereas we're talking mostly on the surface, we're arguing about, and there's a freakouts on both sides, and I'm seeing it, including myself and my friends. We spend a lot of time saying, this is bullshit. Look at this. That's bullshit. Look how terrible this is. That's not really changing anything. And we have these protests, which I think are great in one sense, but are they effective? And what else do we need to do is the question I'm left with.
So, what do you think? One option not option, but one way to think about things is that the pressures that we're feeling right now between competing old worldviews may very well be what's needed to come up with a new one.
Right.
So perhaps it is about, you need that pressure to find where that escape hole is going to come from that will relieve that pressure somewhat. That's an unexpected place where the pressure gets released,
Right.
But it's hard to, even when you say like, we need to figure out what our worldview is, like, yes, but then that needs to get translated into a set of actions that will then, I think it almost seems like those are two different modes of actions. One is like just trying to grapple with how to operate in this now slightly more troubling environment we find ourselves in, while keeping in mind that this might require us in the long. You're talking about the long game, I guess, right?
Yeah.
Keeping in mind that eventually we're probably going to need to come up with something new, and so we need to think about that as well.
Yeah.
And then there's a lot of things we need to do at the same time.
Right.
And I probably that's why. A lot of people are getting Facebook fatigue, especially those that are most concerned about what's going on because their feeds are filled with varying degrees of hysteria, not in a kind of pejorative way, but really like true kind of alarming
kind of an apt term.
things.
Yeah.
So I think being able to manage the complexity of how we're supposed to operate from the short term all the way to the long term, how we act today, plan for the future, give ourselves time to decompress, all that sort of stuff. I think that's a very useful set of tools that people are looking for right now. Like, what is the operating model to do all that?
Right. What I find interesting, though, is that it's, and I think this is kind of a malaise of our modern world, and maybe our step into the postmodern, is that, and maybe even Nietzsche was talking about this a while ago, is that even when you think about worldviews, when you think, oh, I have this worldview, you have this worldview, and that affects how we're affected, like the fact that you realize there are worldviews becomes kind of a nihilistic position that people move to. It's like, oh, if there's so many worldviews and none of them are really, objectively right, what does that mean, for truth in the world? And a lot of people, I think, at that point will just give up and think, oh my God, nothing's certain. I'm just going to live my own life and, disengage. Some people will take that and think, well, since there's no foundations for anything, I'm just going to do my will to power and I'm going to, aggrandize myself, and people take this approach. So I'm saying, like, if you're functioning within a worldview, it's actually quite a bit easier, rather than stepping out and thinking that there are worldviews that I'm operating within, and it just kind of takes the question to another outer shell.
But don't you find that there's like two different? I'm happy to kind of. Exist both at a meta level and then let's call it a corporeal level. Okay,
right.
So I'm totally fine existing on both planes. Meaning, at a meta cerebral level, I find the mental gymnastics needed to kind of juggle understanding of multiple worldviews, see how like these three worldviews created this meta worldview, blah, blah,
Right.
there's something kind of almost, what's the word I'm looking for? Like almost spoiled about being able to and enjoy that kind of mental gymnastics, right? But while I'm doing that, my corporeal self is like, you know what? Just be kind and love people. Like, so that is less a worldview than a mode of operating physically in the world. And I think that's where I think you can have both.
You can.
And I think that's what I find very heartening about, and I don't know whether this has always been the case or whether this case is much more made explicit because we communicate more today. But you see a lot of that. Like I see a lot of that amongst my friends, that at the end of the day, it all actually gets reduced to those two things. Don't be an asshole and know that love is real. And as long as, I mean, it sounds cheesy, but it's not at all. Like, it's like, that is what it is. And then, keep that in mind, and then, and then do whatever you need to do to make sense of what's going on and to be able to, rationalize, not even rationalize, but like maybe create a set of tasks or actions to try to move the current reality into the more optimal future reality, whatever that is. And it can be less or more. Like, so for example, maybe the future reality is just get Trump impeached for some people. The future reality may be get the whole bloody people, all of them out the White House and whatever, but there are those actions, but then always remember that there's that one kind of way to like actually just physically operate in the world.
Yeah, I think you're pointing out something very important here, which is, essentially, if we're approaching the world cerebrally or corporeally, as you put it, and again, going back to my own personal experience, it seemed like for most of my life it was mostly cerebral, and not paying attention to the corporeal, and I find that I've been more successful and more happy in my own personal way once I'm able to, bring in both of those ways of being and paying attention to it. But not everybody is there or can be, and I think what we're finding, I guess the question we're asking sometimes and seeing an answer to is in Silicon Valley, for example, if you have great intelligence, does that necessarily mean that you're going to make good moral decisions? And it doesn't appear to be the case. I think you also need to have kind of a mix of what you say, like the emotional intelligence that's there. And how do we instill more of that into the world? Maybe through narratives, maybe through art, maybe through, these are the kind of answers that I'm coming across sometimes. And
actually, you know what? I was just in Paris recently, and so my partner is French, and I was in Gare du Nord, so which is where all the trains come in, and it's fucking packed, and there's everyone there, like all the different people are there, and it's like incredible. I actually think that part of the problem may be in us not being able to live, to understand this notion of like at the core of not being an asshole, is because we're so distant from just the pure mass of people that you need to be around all the time.
That's true.
Okay.
Yeah.
And, so if you're rich enough, you'll take an Uber here, you'll go to the restaurants there, you'll go to your fancy club there, you'll go to this. So in Silicon Valley, that has happened by, having your own buses, so you don't have to take your own public transportation. So the complete kind of disregard for public space as a space that you actually should be in because it's good for you, I think has resulted in a kind of a break of what it actually means to be in a mass of humanity.
Yeah.
And it's a physical thing, you know?
Yeah.
It's the fact that it's okay for you to be side by side with your forearms touching someone's forearms in a subway station, and there's all sorts of smells, and some of it smells good, some of it smells bad, and, you know, someone's talking too loudly, and you're all negotiating with each other how to all be in that train and not actually harm anyone, you know? And sometimes you feel like saying, fuck, I wish you'd shut up, and I've had a bad day. But you don't, because you live in a society and you don't do that. And so you just need practice doing that.
So what does the advent of VR mean for this, for example? Because it's going to remove some of those layers and frequencies in which we connect with others.
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I mean, I think part of the issue with replacing that physical closeness with sort of virtual closeness or different sort of forms of social interactions, like in Facebook, for example. Like if you just forget about VR, like you could say, well, Facebook is this massive thing, but this mass where you get to talk to different people and you do learn different social modes of behavior. Like you try not to be an asshole on Facebook either, and you kind of don't want to be like a troll, and so you learn that stuff, right?
Sure.
But what you don't learn is, which we've talked about, is that unlike that subway train where, you know, there's everything and everyone in that train with you, in Facebook, it's not everything and everyone in your feed with you, right? And similarly, virtual reality, if it follows, and this is what I mean by understanding the context of where these technologies are being built, if it follows, I don't see any reason why it wouldn't, the kind of ways of behaving, the kind of core foundations that is its sort of parent, you know, its core foundations, the Facebook terms and conditions, then it's going to follow exactly similar types of modes of experience as we've seen in Facebook, albeit with more three-dimensional kind of maybe photorealistic spaces, you know? So it's just going to be more of the same.
Yeah, I mean, Oculus, as you say, was bought by Facebook, so it seems like they're kind of planning ahead for maybe we meet in rooms.
Exactly.
With our friends on Facebook and we chat
so
there.
You'll have avatars, but like, how are they going to deal with echo chambers in VR if they haven't dealt with echo chambers in Facebook?
Yeah,
and is it going to be advertising driven in VR as it is in advertising driven in Facebook? You know, like what data are they collecting in their VR chat rooms versus the ones that they're collecting in Facebook? So you can just imagine that that's just going to be amplified as you move into VR.
Especially when you think about these kind of like haptic suits that we're going to be wearing, and it's going to be essentially collecting data points of your heartbeat, your skin conductivity, all that other stuff. It's going to be collecting that data, which it means that it's going to know a lot more about you than even now.
Yeah.
So the data we're collecting now by, the likes that you hit and the pages that you go to are very useful to get into our mind, our conscious mind, essentially.
Yeah.
But once you connect our physical bodies to this network, essentially, and it's collecting data points about our physical body, then you're learning something more about that person that's a lot deeper in some sense, and in some ways much more... you're much more able to get at the core of somebody.
Yeah, you can manipulate them much more easily.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, and I gave a TEDx Toronto talk on this thing, and I talked about it as like, the sub-zero moment of truth, because the zero moment of truth framework is what, search essentially is, the ability to want to figure out what it is that you want to buy before you want to buy it by searching for it. The sub-zero moment of truth, I'm saying, is that the system knows what you want to buy before you even know you want to buy it.
Right.
And they can actually already do that, like, just through your data, the data that they collect, they can assume that you're pregnant. And so they will push, pregnancy test ads on you once you're in kind of a much more immersive environment whereby feedback is being gathered. That's a no-brainer. Like, they'll know you're sick way in advance.
Oh yeah, they're gonna know things that you like that you don't know you like.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, like if you're in a VR environment and just the fact that your eye happened to glance at something in the back of the room, maybe, I don't know, certain type of woman, and it realizes that you have a sexual response to it. So they're going to know how to market to you based on that. And it's going to be completely, it's not going to be transparent to us at all. So that's kind of worrisome.
No, it is very worrisome. Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure.
And it's like the more we engage, the more we're vulnerable in these networks. And a few years ago, I signed up for this 23andMe.
Oh yeah, did you find out what you were?
It was very very fun and useful. But I got to say, before I collected the swab in my cheek and I put it in there, but I didn't send it away for quite a while because I had this quandary. I kept thinking, what am I doing here? I'm sending my DNA profile to a third party.
Yeah.
And if they hold on to this, what can they do with it in 20 years, 30 years? I mean, are they going to be able to completely recreate me from this? Are they going to be able to know something more about me? I mean, right now, maybe the technology doesn't exist.
Yeah.
But, so it's like every time, or when you sign up for Facebook, it's that same kind of feeling. It's like, do I really want to engage this? Because they're going to just find out so much more about me and as a result be able to manipulate me.
Yeah.
How do we do that without that suspicion? I've seen this, there's kind of these new technologies that are, like a blockchain-based social network, for example, that's, trying to get around Facebook. I'd like to see things like that.
Yeah.
But I also worry that, like anything, it will also be corrupted, but maybe it's just kind of like an arms race that we keep going to the next platform, to the next platform, to the next platform, and we just have to be content with the notion that it's never going to be set and we're always going to have to jump ship.
Well, this is why I've never been a proponent of like government is bad, like never, because you do need some kind of civic service oversight, civil service oversight on some of these things. Like the only way through this stuff is regulation. And I think it was okay for us to be, less involved in or less interested or less sort of bullish about regulation in the beginning, because we were, as I said at that time, we're like, the internet is free. We can just do, it'll resolve itself. I mean, naively. And then, but I think today it's actually not naive. It's very dangerous to adopt that same stance.
Yeah. We're both focused on kind of the future of technology, and we talked a little bit about VR. And the question I asked just before that was, if you have great intelligence, does that necessarily mean you have emotional intelligence? And not necessarily so. But when we're talking about intelligences in the extreme, like a super intelligence, we're creating these artificial intelligences. I don't know if you've given any thought to this.
Yeah.
What are we going to expect? Does that come into play in the realm that you're working in at the Canadian Film Centre?
Yeah, we do have a number of machine learning startups that we're working with, and where it gets interesting in terms of where it comes into play is some of the sort of points of view of the founders that we work with, where they've kind of put they kind of like bet on the notion that for machines to be truly intelligent, they actually need to understand narrative. So we're working with some startups whose job or whose core kind of goal is to understand, how to quantify narrative forms by gathering data from people, and then taking those structures and then embedding that into the machine learning systems that they're building.
What is that? Have you been, as a result of this, thinking kind of in a meta sense about narrative? I mean, what is the difference between like narrative and understanding in general? Is it like every time we understand something, are we imposing a narrative on something? Is that at the core of it?
Well, you could argue that basically meaning is narrative, and that we the way we make sense of the world, you could argue is narrative, and that we take fragments of and pieces of information, and then we string them together to create sort of something, and to create sense. And so in that you can argue that narrative is that the meaning making kind of activity that we're engaged in. Now, some narratologists would argue that's too broad. It's actually really about this, the kind of whatever Aristotelian structure,
Right.
and if it doesn't follow that, then it's not narrative. In this sense, I think some of the people that we're working with think about it more broadly than that.
Yeah, I mean, maybe we need different words for it. I mean, there's the broad sense of narrative, there's the dramatic sense of narrative that we're talking about in terms of storytelling proper. But and I even think of worldviews are essentially narrative structures that you're putting on in a grand sense on everything, and to see how everything functions. So your focus at the CFC is about essentially new ways to bring narratives out to the world. Is that, tell me.
Well, we've had so many different foci. I mean, when we first started, it was really this notion that, okay, now we've got this digital networked infrastructure. You can call it the internet, you can call it the web, you can call it ITV, interactive television, but it's like, it's the foundational infrastructure through which all information is going to be either absorbed or gathered, right? And so when we first began, it's really like, well, who are the storytellers that are going to be able to, work within this type of environment? And so it's really about like the different kinds of stories that are going to be told as a result of digital networked infrastructure, the types of storytellers, the types of audiences, how audiences are going to actually consume this stuff or participate in this stuff. And, we produced over 100 different types of prototypes of different forms of interactive and immersive stories, if you will. And
what have you noticed so far in terms of when you're presenting or creating narratives in that realm? How is it different? How is it better? How is it worse? What are you noticing in terms of some patterns for alternate ways of?
Well, I think the big kind of pattern that we've discovered is just, interactive storytelling outside of the gaming environment is still very much a niche form. And it never really took off. Like whether it was on CDs or on the web or on mobile or on other kinds of devices, it's not like people have decided to move in droves into consuming and participating in interactive stories. Now, games are a very different thing entirely.
If I may, to differentiate between gaming and interactive storytelling, it seems to me that there's kind of a leveling of those worlds.
There's like a hybrid form, but the way to think about it is that games are goal based.
Right.
Interactive stories don't necessarily have goals.
Okay.
So in a game, you obviously there are interactive story games where the goal is both to reach a goal and also understand the story being told as a way to reach the goal. But typically interactive stories are like stories that are told with some participation from the user, or at least some kind of interaction between systems, whether that's like network, different types of computers in a network, etc.
Right.
And the purpose of it is to impart some kind of story or meaning. And so those forms, although much lauded critically, like the Webbies have awards for them, all sorts of different conferences happen, etc. It really hasn't taken off. And where VR becomes an interesting, and it may very well be that it just takes a long time, like we're only in our, 20th year of this shit. So maybe it takes, so film took this much time to develop. And so perhaps the interactive storytelling space or experience needs a little bit more time, like 40, 50 more years for it to really take off.
Yeah, that's a good analogy. I mean, if you look at film, it came out maybe 100 years ago plus, but it took maybe quite a few decades before you started seeing art. And then it started to develop its own kind of aesthetic realm that we can discuss it as art. Have you seen that already happening within these alternative technological ways of presenting narratives? Is there art being done already?
Oh yes, absolutely. It's not so
much. It's not just novelty driven.
No. I think there's definitely seminal pieces that have been created. When I talk about it as being niche, I just mean like it just hasn't found its audience yet, and so perhaps it is about the distribution system for interactive stories, and maybe VR is the distribution system that we've been waiting for. for that. VR is slightly different in that it's a full immersive type of environment, but it's the same in that we're talking about interaction. We're talking about immersion. You're talking about similar properties that are that exist across that entire set of different platforms within the digital and networked environment.
Right. Now, within those environments, it seems like I'm imagining. I haven't tried on VR. I've been kind of waiting for the technology to catch up, and I think it's finally here. And I think this year I'm going to probably buy some gear and try it out. But it seems like I can anticipate that when you're in these realms, we talk about interaction. We could be interacting with other people within the realm with their avatars, but you're also going to be interacting with an artificial intelligence to a great degree. There's going to be worlds where people will go in and essentially be like a solipsistic universe, where you're interacting with avatars that aren't necessarily people that in the real world. That they're actually an artificial intelligence that, much like Facebook learns about us and then feeds us with things that we want to know, this AI will start to learn more about us and customize the game or the experience or the novel. What do you see in terms of the future socialization of that? Because right now you have people that complain about, some of their kids usually playing video games too much, for example, locking themselves in their rooms for days at a time. It's going to become even more seductive to be in a completely immersive virtual reality realm. And I'm gonna say that there's probably going to be a large segment, or at least a segment of the population, that's going to be problematic for, and they're going to be in this realm more than they're in the other realm, which we call meat space. And then thinking ahead even further, where you have virtual reality realm that might have a virtual reality realm within it. If you have the computing capacity, that might have a virtual reality realm within it, and people could be going down these shells. I can see kind of a future of a confused mindset for some people, and the kind of confusion of reality. And I almost feel like what we're experiencing now culturally is kind of the early ripples of this confusion of reality that's coming in the future. What's true, what's not, where am I, what's the narrative, who's in charge? All these questions that are going to become more and more confused when you're in these realms. How does that bode for the future, do you think?
Yes, I totally agree with you. I think in a way, if you can imagine that this is the place where we're at now, which is this kind of crossroads in terms of really having to kind of parse truth from fiction and things like that, both in the analog realm and in the virtual realm.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
If you think about it in those terms, then I think that's a good place to start in terms of how to then mitigate the risk against creating a future that's more amplified in these ways, and a lot of that has to do with, again, boring stuff, but like critical thinking, media literacy, all the kind of really, really important skills that we need to start teaching ourselves and our kids. And it's quite frightening how no one seems to be dealing with these issues right now in a concerted way. Because as we know, this stuff evolves very, very quickly and gets absorbed into sort of social norms quite quickly. And all of a sudden, we're catching up as opposed to creating plans to stave off the reactions or behaviors to it, Yeah. So I do think that, so just as an example, my son who's 7, I'm always in a battle. We're always in a battle with him about, how much screen time he gets, et cetera. And I'm fairly open with him about, fine, you can play on a server in Minecraft, but you're not allowed to friend anyone, and this is what you do. So we're constantly talking about like how to deal with this. What does Google, he's not allowed to use the Google search bar because when he puts something on Google, he doesn't have the wherewithal yet to know whether that piece of information is good or not, et cetera. Right. So we talk about this stuff a lot, but I was thinking, my God, but that's me. Like the reason why I talk about it because I'm in the middle of this thing, right? but he's got, 19 other friends in his school, and half of them are recent immigrants, and they may know this stuff, some of them may not, but you can bet that a good proportion of the parents and children who are trying to navigate this don't really have the information on hand to be able to talk about this with their children. And so I called Media Matters in Ottawa, which is this not-for-profit around media literacy, and I said, look, my son goes to a French school. He's in grade 1. I want a digital media literacy workshop. Like, where do I find that? How much will it cost? Who's running them? Because it's not being run by the public school system, which is odd. And they're all using some kind of iPad device, etc. So we shouldn't. This is actually more important than sex ed, I believe. And so it's like we need to start this early. And they said, I know, it's terrible. We don't really have anyone. We've been trying to get funding to try to get this done, and we can. And so we're this is something that is actually quite it's pretty important kind of battle to wage right now, I think.
Yeah, and it's also the time when they're cutting all of these things, so it makes it even more difficult to do.
Yeah.
The future, children. So again, we're back to this, when you're dealing with your 7-year-old, you often will maybe tell them something like, don't do this. And if the question is why, and your answer sometimes is just because.
Yeah.
Because it's just too, maybe it's too difficult to explain, or maybe it's that if you explain it, it might open up a whole other can of worms that you don't want to go down. And so I'm kind of left wondering about this writ large on our culture. Like, how do we do this without being, overbearing and elitist and treating people like children and thinking we have all the answers when it seems clear that we have some answers. And but I guess the thing is to be questioning of yourself as well. And I'm a and this, I thank my partner Priyam for this,
which is at some point the best thing you can do is to just go, look, you got to say please. You got to say thank you. You sit down. You let that person sit down before you do. Those kinds of just pure and I don't think those things are partisan values.
No. In fact, they could probably all agree on that. Yeah,
exactly. So we need some form of commitment to civility, I think, and as I said before, what tends to happen is that the more and this is why VR and like moving into the bubble and getting into that stuff is potentially a sort of a kind of a, what's the word, an action against civility, because we need to be in that kind of civic space to be able to exercise and practice civility. Yeah. And we need to practice it in the same way that we're practicing piano and things like that. And that's how we're going to become better people and better able to actually potentially make decisions that may not have anything to do with civility, that may have something to do with our varying worldviews, but can come together at that one, can be brought together at that one point,
Yeah, it's amazing how many times with conversations like this, you kind of bring it to, well, if people were just, nicer to each other. Yeah. And the way we do that, with children is to instill upon them the sense of politeness or, social behavior. And, maybe school is really for that more than anything else, is to, it's good citizenship.
Yeah. And I think, we pay attention, there's a whole kind of drive around digital citizenship and what that means, and digital rights. And I think that's good. But in terms of the fact that trend seems to be moving towards making sure that those things get taught in school, but I think they need to move a lot faster. Because the technology just changes so quickly and gets adopted so quickly that the sort of norms that we're trying to instill on how you're supposed to behave with these new tools aren't being shared and or talked about as quickly as they're being adopted. you
Yeah,
know?
true enough.
So,
All right. Thank you for the conversation.
well, thanks
That
for
was
being
fun.
here.
Yeah.
No, that's great. Thank
Yeah.
you so
Give me a high
much,
five.
Jake.
Got it. Right on.